Okay, so welcome to Heritage Investigators. Today we're looking at a cold case and how we use our investigative techniques and detective techniques to try to crack sometimes cases that are sometimes decades old. And we have one a live example this time. It's one
A
of
live
yours, Mark.
example of a dead person.
Yes.
Who happens to be my great-great-grandfather, George.
And when did you first start looking into him?
George's history. I think, like a lot of people, I started with talking to family, speaking to my grandmother. She passed away in 1974, so a long time ago. But I asked her, I was always curious about family and family history. And she had a little bit of information about her grandfather, who passed away a few years before she was born. But the information she had was, and that she passed on that piqued my curiosity, was that he was related to the German royal family. And I was very impressed as a teenager that he was related to the royal family. So that was my very first beginnings of stepping into genealogy as a hobby, a long-term hobby. Yeah.
So, do you know what? Had she heard from her parents that
she'd heard from her mother, who'd also passed away quite young. So it was word of mouth. And this is where I think can see the links between detective work, investigative work, and a cold case, and what we do in genealogy and what genealogy is all about. Because word of mouth is not proof. And the only information I had was that George was German and related to the Kaiser, to the royal German royal family. But that was secondhand information when I received it. I won't jump to the end of the story, but yeah, it turns out that relying just on information that comes from family or firsthand from people who claim to be a witness is not always the best way to start in genealogy. So
what steps did you take after that? So once you had that discussion with her, and then she subsequently died and wasn't around to ask anymore.
Exactly. And I'd always been curious about George. And a lot of the family, there was talk that there was more to his story. So the first place to start, being in Australia, was to get his death certificate. Given he was born in Germany, in those days it was quite difficult. 40 years ago, there wasn't the internet. So I applied to the state records, the New South Wales births, deaths and marriages, for his death certificate. And I knew that he'd passed away before my grandmother was born, so I knew it was prior to 1907. And it was a written application. You had to send a check in the mail, very old-fashioned. But then I got the death certificate, and that really piqued my interest because his cause of death was not what I expected it to be. Cause of death was suicide, and written that he had shot himself through the head on a vacant block of land. I was shocked. And I don't think my grandmother knew that information.
She didn't know.
I don't think so, because the information she had been secondhand from her mother. And again, this is where listening just to family stories quite often leads you down the wrong path. I think perhaps her mother may have known, but suicide being such a taboo in that time, they probably covered it up, and he was related to the German royal family. Sounds better than the only information we have was that he killed himself.
Yeah, sure.
So then it became a quest, a lifelong quest that continues to find out what led to that result by one family member. So.
Yeah, sure. It's probably something that her mother didn't really want to talk about either. If that's
Absolutely.
the way to just shame or anything like that aside, but
shame, embarrassment. It was a different era. I did from that certificate, though, get some information. I knew the date that had happened. I found out it was in 1904. And that was a starting point. It was the first documentary evidence I had about George's life.
Yeah. Okay. So what did you do after that?
There were limited resources at the time. All that was available was birth certificates, marriage certificates, and death certificates. I knew I couldn't get his birth certificate because that would have been in Germany. So I got his marriage certificate. That gave me a little bit more information. I'd worked back approximately when he would have been married, just from his death, and I found out he was born in around 1830 from the death certificate saying he was died around age 74. But again, secondhand information. That information recorded on a death certificate was not by George himself, obviously. It was by his son-in-law. And his son-in-law was relying on information from George. So all things he'd heard through the family. So I had the information regarding his wife, where they were married, Catherine McQueen. But then there was a pause because it was very hard to get more detailed information until along came the internet. And then everything changed. Everything was possible.
So what did you get from the marriage certificate?
The marriage certificate, I only got the name of his wife, but also there was very strange on marriage certificates, or most marriage certificates around the world, it will have the mother and father's name of the bride and of the groom.
Yeah.
At their wedding, there were apparently only two other people at the wedding, which I found out from a different source later to be discussed. But missing on next to both their names were the names of the father and mother. And I don't know to this day why the names of the mother and father were not recorded by either of them. What was written on the certificate by hand on the day in the same pen was a name Wolf Levi under his father's name, but that was crossed out. I still have that certificate, but I still don't understand why that was written there. And for a long time, that led me down, again, another path, a different path. I was then looking what I thought, Jewish name, Jewish relative, Jewish father. And it was all wrong. It was simply a mistake. I believe a mistake on the certificate.
Okay, sure.
So again, it's trying to get even written information can be wrong and lead you down the wrong path.
Yeah. Okay. So did you have any information about him arriving in Australia?
There were, as time went on and I learned more about genealogy, I learned that there is always somewhere else to look. That's what I find exciting. The more experience you get, the more places there are to look. He was, as it said on the death certificate, Australian, born in Germany, but Australian. So I knew that at some point he probably, not necessarily, but probably became an Australian citizen or a British subject at that time. I managed through the National Archives of Australia to get a copy of his naturalisation certificate. On the certificate, it was only his name and the date that he became naturalised as a citizen, which was 1868, I believe. But very interestingly, he had put in his own hand that he had arrived in 1857 on the ship Albion, and that his place of birth was a town called Rodheim in the Grand Duchy of Hesse. That was such a landmark. That was gold mine of information. Fantastic.
Because before that, you just thought he was from Frankfurt. Is that right? Which is
the death certificate had listed his place of birth as Frankfurt. And again, that was information given by the son-in-law. Got to be careful when reading death certificates in particular, that the information is secondhand again, and people make mistakes or they're upset and they're not thinking properly. Frankfurt was a good clue because it turned out that Rodheim was only about 30 kilometres from Frankfurt. So that was confirmation to me that, not if I needed confirmation because it was written in George's hand that he was born in Rodheim. I could look it up. I could do some research online. Google it. I found out where Rodheim was, that it was close to Frankfurt, that there was the Grand Duchy of Hesse, later became part of Germany. So,
and people out here probably would have heard of Frankfurt, but they wouldn't have heard of a smaller place like. So it's natural to say
exactly
the closest.
Yeah.
You know, if you're from the Blue Mountains, say, you might tell people overseas you're from Sydney because they don't know the.
That's right. The specifics. We all do that. We go to the nearest city. We tend to make it easy for relatives. Oh, it was near Frankfurt I was born. So that was my gold mine. From that point on, I knew where he was born. I could work out very roughly when he was born. But then I hit the big, what we call in genealogy, the roadblock, where there was nowhere else to go. I couldn't find on any of the search engines that I used, and the search engines were becoming more and more sophisticated. German records tended to be by state of the federal Germany, rather than the old state prior to, I think, 1871 when Germany was formed. He was born in 1830 in a principality. Records were far more difficult to locate. And it was decades before I could get through that roadblock.
So it became a cold case after a while.
Cold case again. We've got George. But
what happened to him?
Where did he come? Yeah. How did he get here? And why did he come? Yeah. Why did he leave home? The real breakthrough was DNA. When DNA was made available through some of the more popular search engines like Ancestry, MyHeritage, I used that opportunity, did some DNA tests, sent away. For a long time, nothing happened on that particular branch of the family. Other parts of the family, I was connected to second, third, fourth cousins, got some really good information on other people on the tree. But for that particular branch, the surname never came up. There was nobody until about 5 years ago when I was contacted by a fifth cousin who'd also done her DNA. She lived in New York City, a completely different surname, but asked if I was any relation, through DNA, we were somehow fifth cousins, and the one common surname was George's surname. So I was very excited. I contacted her and went, absolutely, I am. He's somebody I've been trying to trace for many years and find out a little more about his history in Germany. She had visited Germany, visited the village, and had a copy of a book in German, Familien book, which was the whole history of our family going back 500 years. And I was able to look through the book and found a George with his surname, the exact dates in Rodheim, and the history of the family going back another 500 years. So it was
10 Christmases at once.
Again, it was like a detective almost solving a case.
Yeah.
Almost, because there's still things that are mysteries, things that I haven't yet discovered. But I think you've got to be an optimist. You've got to keep... Genealogy is not something that happens overnight.
No.
You can just concentrate on getting births and deaths and putting dates and throwing people at a tree, which is great to get the overall picture. But I like to build the story around individuals within the tree.
Yeah.
And that's the detective work.
Yeah. Because they were individuals of real lives. They weren't just...
That's right. They weren't a number. They didn't just have a birth, a marriage, and a death. There was so much more, just like there is to us. So it's that excitement of rebuilding, and that is like a cold case. It's what was the person like? What did they like? Why did they live the way they did? Why did George, in the end, take his own life?
Yeah.
When you look at the whole history of his life and the pressures and the horrors that happened during his life, and there's so much more to him than we've talked about. He had an incredibly stressful life. Another very useful tool I found were newspaper articles. We're very lucky in Australia to have Trove, which is a website connected, I believe, to the National Archives.
Yes, correct.
And I put in his name in the year that he committed suicide. It was incredible, the number of articles written about George at the time. He had been hounded by local larrikins, they were called, youths, gangs, for being German, having a strong German accent. This is prior to the First World War. He'd basically been hounded to death by people throwing rocks at his house. He actually had a mad cat thrown on him at one point. He was, people would, the gangs, the teenagers would wait for him to come home from the train station and throw rocks at him. He had a very difficult last few years, totally alone, very isolated. But all this the sympathy I feel for him now came from rebuilding his story and understanding his battles.
And so what did it say about him as a person, those articles we read on Trove?
Some of the articles were written in a very unsympathetic way. They classed him, one of the headlines I remember was saying, irritable German kills himself. Well, I'm like, that's not a nice way to describe one of my great-granddad. Whereas others were more sympathetic and tried to understand the situation that was going on. In the end, the police commissioner was asked by the New South Wales Premier to conduct an investigation and find out what had happened. And there wasn't an apology, but there was, it was acknowledged that this man had been hounded to death. So not a happy ending, but still, at least his story's not forgotten.
Yeah, that's right.
And he's not just forgotten in our family or disgraced in our family. Everybody now knows his story.
Yeah. And where was he living? He was in Sydney.
He was in Sydney when he died. Yeah. But how he got to Sydney is still a mystery. As I mentioned earlier, on the naturalization certificate, it was written that he had arrived on the Albion as a ship in 1857. Very specific.
Yeah.
And yet I found through National Archives of Australia, which is a really great resource, that all the shipping lists, and you can get the passenger list of all the passengers who were on that ship.
Yes.
The ship did come in 1857. There are records of it going into Melbourne Harbour. It did come from Liverpool. There were Germans on that ship.
Yeah.
But not one of the names or one of the professions matched George. I don't understand why he's not on that list.
Yes.
And again, they're the mysteries that shouldn't discourage people. They should encourage you to try and think, how do I get around? How do I make genealogy is that search that?
And it makes it more rewarding when you eventually do find out that information. If it all came at you too easily, it'd be, you lose part of the fun, wouldn't you?
The fun is going into the detail. I think with the new search engines, you can build your tree fairly quickly. As long as you know your grandparents' names, dates of birth, that's quite helpful. And you can put that into the search engines that are available, and very quickly you can build a tree. You have to be so careful doing it. Keep the detective in mind that you need evidence, hard evidence. You can't rely on family stories.
No.
You can't always rely on one document alone. My document that, on his wedding, it was written that his father's name was crossed out. I don't know why that happened, because now I've got confirmation in writing from Germany. His father's name was Conrad.
Right.
His mother's name was Maria Jacobi. I know their whole family history. It's very detailed, very well documented in that village, in the church. It's all in the same books and preserved for centuries. I don't know where the name came from, but, you have to accept some things to move on.
Yeah. George was a tailor, is that right?
That's right. And his father was also a tailor. Yeah.
So do you know how he ended up apparently having some wealth in Australia? If you own multiple houses, but he don't know how a tailor in Germany became wealthy.
I don't know how a tailor in Germany got to Australia. I don't know how he afforded it, nor why he came to Australia. One avenue I was investigating was the German states were highly militarized at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Was he trying to avoid military service? I don't know, but he came out. I'm still investigating that as a possibility. Mm-hmm. Also, if he came out alone or brought siblings with him, mm-hmm. and that's a new area of investigation. Mm-hmm. I tend to focus just on George. Now his extended family, his brothers, sisters, mm-hmm. his mother. I've still got some work to do on the German side.
And you have, from that book you got hold of,
I had their records. Mm-hmm. Again, I've got their births and deaths, but some of them, the deaths are not recorded, mm-hmm. which makes me think it wasn't in Germany. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean they came with him to Australia. They may have gone to the States, or just no record was mm-hmm. kept. But mm-hmm. I've got a feeling perhaps maybe somebody came with him.
Yeah, sure.
So, and when he came here working as a tailor, I can't find records of where he worked as a tailor. Or did he give up working as mm-hmm. a tailor and do other work? Mm-hmm. Somehow he ended up with enough wealth for a few houses. He had some money, several £100, which was quite a lot of money in the 1890s, but he didn't have that when he passed away. Mm-hmm. So what happened mm-hmm. to pull him down again in the world? And that's something that we'll investigate. Keep mm-hmm. going. Always optimistic.
Yes.
Always try to be optimistic and just keep going. Yeah.
So what are your sort of research priorities for him?
I think I know George pretty well, but I would like to, as we've just discussed, I'd like to know more about what was his motivation for leaving Germany? Mm-hmm. How did he get here? Mm-hmm. And a lot more about what happened when he got here. Mm-hmm. I can't believe... I don't believe there are no records. Mm-hmm. I just haven't been lucky enough or focused enough on that part of his life. And I will focus on that part of his life now.
Sure.
Trying to flesh out even more of George's story. So,
because it's a very interesting story, especially when you know how it ends. It makes you all the more curious as to what led up to at that point.
I have more records on his death than I do of his life. Mm-hmm. All the newspaper articles, mm-hmm. many newspaper articles, mm-hmm. and a commission by the police of New South Wales. The Premier of New South Wales was encouraged people to investigate why this old man was driven to shoot himself. Mm-hmm. But I want to know how he lived, mm-hmm. not how he died.
Yes.
And I think that story... I don't think I'll finish it, mm-hmm. but I do hope mm-hmm. other members of the family will carry the torch and finish it.
So you can leave behind one day in the distant future whatever you manage to find on him.
Yeah,
for now, and it's a way of keeping his memory alive.
Exactly.
Nobody down the track will remember him, but it's a way of sort of keeping that, something which preserves who he was as a person. Make sure he's not forgotten, and not just a name in a tree.
No, that he's actually a person. He was a person. He's part of me. Mm-hmm. He always will be. Mm-hmm. And it's great to welcome him back in some ways. Mm-hmm. It's honouring a memory. So, yeah.
And you still need a photo as well.
I definitely need a photo. George is just an image in my head. Mm-hmm. I know that because he passed away in 1904, the chances are somewhere in the world there's a photo of George. Mm-hmm. I haven't found it yet, but I'm still optimistic. Keep plugging away. That's what genealogy is. Keep plugging away.
Do you hope to get over to Germany at some point when you're in that part of the world?
I will go to the village. I'd like to go there. I don't think there are more resources available. You never know, but mm-hmm. I would like to go to the village, and I believe that our family's second, third, fourth cousins would still be living in the village. Mm.
Brilliant.
So, yeah, another quest.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you for
thank you for the chat.
We hope you've enjoyed it.
Yes. Thank you for listening or watching. And
and if you've enjoyed it, please hit the thumbs up and feel free to subscribe.
Mm-hmm. And let us know if there's any of the topics we've talked about that you'd like to hear more about.
Yeah, we're more than happy to answer you directly.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.